I look forward to hearing more for the rest of the night.
Now moving on to our third speaker, Dr. Stephen Hale. Stephen has insisted that I do not waste any time introducing him. So all I'll say is he's an economist at the University of Adelaide, the best lecturer I've ever had in my studies, and an advocate for a federal job guarantee and an approach to macroeconomics called modern monetary theory. Please join me in introducing Stephen Hale.
Excuse me a moment while I put my old man glasses on. I can either see the computer these days, or I can see how beautiful you all are. So it's probably more important that I see the computer for the moment. Here we go. I'm going to talk to you about a federal job guarantee and an income guarantee. But first of all, I wanted to thank you all so much for coming along. It's really stressful organising something like this, even with the support of all the people that have helped me out. And I'm so grateful that everybody's come, because I had a nightmare in the middle of the night that Alice was here and Claudia was here and there was no one else. Initially, what I wanted to do was to encourage a few students to come along and to listen to Alice and Claudia talking about the kind of issues that you don't usually get to listen to. And then Gabby Bond from Get Up got on board, and it was promoted more generally, and that's why so many of you have come along. As I said, I'm very grateful for that. I'm grateful for the chance to highlight issues like, yes, housing and homelessness, and absolute and relative poverty and inequality, and involuntary unemployment and underemployment in Australia. All of these things are difficult to define, difficult to measure. All of them are interrelated. All of them will be seriously under-discussed in the federal election, in my view. I was lucky enough a few days ago to be invited to an event at the university which was addressed by the very able and intelligent, and his heart's in the right place, Shadow Assistant Treasurer. And he was talking about how, if he was to become the Assistant Treasurer after the federal election, the new government would target inequality in Australia. And I got to ask him a question, because it was organised by some of my students, including Ali, I think. And the question I asked was, well, in Australia, we had a Scandinavian level of inequality in the 1960s and early 70s. Actually, in countries like Denmark, they still have a Scandinavian level of inequality. I said inequality has risen almost continuously in Australia, however you measure it, since about 1974, which, by the way, was the last year when there was genuinely full employment in Australia. And in my question, I first of all said, there's been a Labour government for quite a lot of the time since then, while inequality has been rising. What do you think they did wrong? And the second question I said, it's great that you're targeting inequality now. What's the target going to be? You target the budget. Both the government and the opposition will be vying during the election campaign, promising to have bigger budget surpluses, in my view, pointlessly bigger budget surpluses than each other, which they probably won't record anyway. What's your target for inequality going to be? And to be fair to him, he said, I don't think I could persuade the shadow cabinet to have an explicit target for it. Well, I want a target for inequality. I don't see why Australia can't, over time, not overnight, have a return to Scandinavian levels of inequality, or if you like, it was a different society then in all sorts of ways, but the level of inequality in Australia that used to exist back in the mid-1970s. And I think part of this also involves a return to genuine full employment. I think if we could restore genuinely full employment in Australia, then many of these other issues and social problems that we discuss would actually become much more manageable over time. Way back in the 1930s, in 1936, John Maynard Keynes, that's the guy on the left, wrote these words: "The outstanding faults of the economic society in which we live are its failure to provide for full employment and its arbitrary and inequitable distribution of wealth and incomes." Well, somebody could write that now. Those words still apply now. To an extent, they applied less severely during the period from 1945 to about 1975, when, as I said, there was full employment in Australia. Young people won't believe this, but Robert Menzies almost lost an election in this country in 1962, when the unemployment rate, in the days when there was no underemployment in Australia, went slightly above 2%. That was seen as a scandal in those days. The average level of unemployment was 1-point-something% in those days, with no underemployment. Well, I don't see any reason why we can't have full employment again. And let's see if this will work. If this does work, I'll play you the first 35 seconds. There's no more time. No time for more than that.
Politicians are
This video.
obsessed with jobs. Jobs, 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 jobs. Unemployment, work, and job creation dominate modern political conversations. But are our politicians really doing everything they could be to put ordinary people into dignified, meaningful, and secure work? Absolutely not. I want to talk to you today about a policy that I think is going to become one of the biggest ideas of the next decade. It's called a federal jobs guarantee.
Yes, that's enough. Otherwise, he's going to do the talk for me, and he'll do it much better than me. And he's younger than me, and better looking than me. So we'll get rid of him. But yes, he was talking about a big idea. I want you to think big. There are some members of the Australian Labor Party. There are some members of the Australian Greens here. We are pushing them both as far as the federal job guarantee is concerned in all sorts of avenues at the moment, and I think they're beginning to crack. Things are moving in our direction. I want them to think big, not small, and that big idea that I want them to think about is introducing a federal job guarantee. After all, this is extremely likely to happen in the US if there is a change of president after the next election. Bernie has been pushing the federal job guarantee for a while now, as has Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Stephanie Kelton, that my fellow modern monetary theorist, who is Bernie Sanders' chief economic advisor, and, by the way, is due to visit this university at some point in September or October this year as a Harcourt visiting professor. We haven't firmed up the date yet, but she's promised me 100% she's coming. Bernie's been so successful that it's now almost a requirement, if you want to be a candidate for the Democratic nomination, to either come up with your own version of a job guarantee or to support his. So Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, Kirsten Gillibrand, Cory Booker, they're all leading candidates for the Democrat nomination. They've all advocated for a job guarantee of one kind or another, or have said that they will support it. Consequently, the federal job guarantee has been very widely discussed in the US for some time now, although it has not yet been so widely discussed in Australia, and there's been a lot of opinion polling, and on the whole you find that there is majority support for a federal job guarantee in the US when it's explained to people in virtually every state. There's an overwhelming majority amongst Democrats, There's an overwhelming majority amongst independents. It's about 50-50 amongst Republicans in the US as far as a federal job guarantee is concerned. The federal job guarantee, the way we have designed it, has come out of the work of a group of economists called modern monetary theorists. Stephanie, of course, is one of them. It's particularly associated in Australia with the work of somebody called Professor Bill Mitchell from the University of Newcastle, and it's the first plank in GetUp's economic justice campaign, the Future to Fight For campaign. There it is. The government should guarantee work for all to make sure that every Australian who wants the dignity of full-time paid work with all the attached benefits can have one, and in the process can improve our public services and local communities. Is this insanity? Well, we've got at least one Nobel Prize-winning economist behind Future to Fight For, Joseph Stiglitz. Those were his words when the campaign was launched. Stephanie Kelton, of course, supported it and has been to Australia once already in support of this campaign. And you can tell it's not been widely discussed in Australia by the fact that when they were looking for an Australian economist to quote on their website, they ended up with me. Anyway, it was nice to be connected in some way or another with Stephanie and Joseph Stiglitz. What is a job guarantee? Quickly. It is the offer of public sector employment with a decent income. Yes, at the minimum wage, but I would be pitching the minimum wage somewhat higher than it is at the moment, say $20 an hour, with superannuation and good working conditions to everybody who is not in full-time employment at the moment, who wants a job. It should be flexible so that you can work between 1 and you could make it 38 if you like, but I think that the job guarantee over time should be part of a campaign for us to reduce our standard hours of work rather than increase them. It should be voluntary. No compulsion is involved. No loss of income support for those who choose not to participate. Actually, people like me advocate for something like the New Start payment to become unconditional for people on low incomes at the moment. If you want to stay on that level and not participate in a job guarantee, fine. If you participate in a job guarantee full-time, you'll be on about $40,000 a year, including superannuation, so you'll be making more than twice as much money. We're not taking anything away from people. If we introduce a federal job guarantee, we're giving people an option, a public employment option. And at the moment, our legal minimum wage, of course, isn't a minimum at all, because you have to have a job before you qualify for the minimum wage. If you're, if you're being breached, you're not even getting New Start, but in which case the minimum for you is zero, I suppose. With a federal job guarantee, the wage paid to people participating in the job guarantee would be a genuinely effective minimum wage across the economy as a whole. The idea is not to compete with private sector employers across the income distribution, but it's to set an effective floor, both to wages and to working conditions, which employers have to match and have to be able to match if they want people to work for them. It's really important to get people out of unemployment and into fairly paid work. It's really important to end the curse of underemployment. Yes, we've got an official unemployment rate of only 5% at the moment, but you know, I haven't got time to go through the statistics now in detail. You know how difficult it is to be officially unemployed. We've got about 8.3% of our labour force is underemployed. People have at least 1 hour of paid employment a week, but they want more work. As I said at the beginning, there's various ways of measuring poverty. One commonly used way of measuring relative poverty is to say that you're poor if you're on below 50% of the median disposable income. Once you've taken demographic characteristics of households into account, if you are unemployed, you are most likely to fall into this definition of poverty. If you are employed part-time, okay, it's a much smaller proportion of people, but there are only about a quarter of people who are part-time employed who want more hours anyway, so it's still about 2/3 of people who are underemployed. If you're in full-time employment, unless you've got children, if you're in full-time employment, even at the minimum wage, you're not going to come into this category, this definition of poverty. So, for the most part, if we could move people out of unemployment, if we could move people out of involuntary underemployment, we could move people out of poverty. Why don't these people do it for themselves? Why don't they pull themselves up by their bootstraps instead of sitting around living off the taxpayer, some people will say? Well, it's just not possible. There are 680,000 people who are officially unemployed based on the most recent figures. There are over 1 million people who are underemployed. There are nearly 900,000 people who are classified as marginally attached. That means they've been looking for work recently, but they're not available to start work this week. Or they would like to start work now, but they haven't actively been looking recently. Those two groups are counted as marginally attached. And Claudia was saying that there were about 9 job seekers for every vacant job. If you exclude the marginally attached because of improvements in the labour market recently, it comes out a little bit less than that. But if you include some of these marginally attached, it comes out much more than that, far more than that. No wonder so many people apply for each vacant job. The fact is that the private sector on its own has never ever provided enough jobs for all those who want a job. So you can make people apply for 20 jobs a month. It's just going to mean that there are a lot of applicants for jobs, many of whom are unsuited to them. Employers hate it. Nobody likes that requirement. In the days when there was in the days when there was full employment in Australia, back in the 50s and 60s and early 70s, it was because the government accepted a responsibility to deliver full employment. It was part of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights after the Second World War. There was a government white paper which committed successive governments in Australia to maintain full employment. And the same was true in other countries too. And this continued until the mid-70s, then it changed. Of course, we now have a system which, as Claudia was saying, is punitive. It's not about the government taking responsibility to ensure that there are enough job opportunities there for people who want to work, who want to contribute towards social provisioning. I would like to go back to that situation. We can't go back to the society that existed in the 50s and 60s, and we wouldn't want to. So we need a new way of delivering full employment, and that's what a job guarantee is all about. And don't tell me there's nothing that needs doing. Walk around some of our suburbs and you can see plenty of things that need doing. There's been surveys done a number of times down the years by people like Bill Mitchell at the University of Newcastle, talking to local authorities around the country. I haven't taken what's on this slide directly from any of those surveys. This is just what came to mind as far as I'm concerned. If you were unemployed and there was a federal job guarantee in place, you would go to your local jobs bank. This would not be a private sector organisation. This is part of the state. This would be under a new Commonwealth Employment Service if it was down to me. And you could be working in a variety of different roles. We'd have a Minister for Employment again, not a Minister for Jobs and Small Business, but a Minister for Employment. We wouldn't have a job active network anymore that we spend $1.5 billion on a year. That's $1.5 billion going to the organisations that run it. We'd have a public sector Commonwealth Employment Service again. There'd be offices in the capital cities and major regional centres like Newcastle. And in every local authority, there'd be a job guarantee local office. And if you were unemployed, you'd go to the job guarantee local office. And if you wanted to participate, you'd go to the job guarantee local office. And you'd see a counsellor. And there'd be a variety of employment opportunities available to you. The private sector, I don't think, should play any role in this scheme. So we're talking about government employers here. You could be working for a charity or not-for-profit organisation. That would be one option, but you could be working in environmental services like some of those jobs on the last slide suggested, or community care, or working on small infrastructural projects, or working in a cultural services role. In the New Deal in the 1930s in the US, there were lots of artists and actors and writers who were employed in New Deal programs, and there's no reason why we couldn't do the same sort of thing in the job guarantee. You would need a national template that was laid down by the Commonwealth Government, but you would then allow local government to prioritise jobs and to change the way that the federal job guarantee works, so you wouldn't have the same tasks being done, the same jobs being done in, I don't know, the centre of Sydney as you would in some rural and remote area. People who are unemployed are not unemployed because they're unproductive. If you talk about a federal job guarantee, you always get people say, well, these people, they're unproductive, what are you going to have them doing? Unemployment is not, in general, the fault of the unemployed, otherwise there wouldn't be 10 people to apply for every available job. It's just the fact there aren't enough jobs, and the fact there aren't enough jobs is not because there's not plenty to do, it's because of a lack of funding. Anyway, if you're talking about productivity, these people at the moment, if they're unemployed, are doing not very much, perhaps. So if the alternative is unemployment, job guarantee jobs have a low productivity hurdle to jump. We do not need to make a profit from a job guarantee scheme. Indeed, we don't want to make a profit from it. The government budget is close to balance at the moment. It should be 1.5% or 2% in deficit. This would deliver that deficit. This would create a fiscal balance which I think is appropriate given the state of our economy at the moment. And of course, job guarantee jobs would contribute to the welfare of participants. There are a wide variety of non-financial costs of unemployment that I won't go through just now. And the jobs that people are doing as part of this job guarantee should be designed to benefit the local community, and non-participants will benefit not only from that, but from the security of knowing that if you lose your job, you'll be able to participate in the job guarantee, which will give you more bargaining power if you're in a terrible job, or a really low-paid job at the moment anyway. This is not work for the dole. Work for the dole is punitive. Work for the dole is something you have to do in order to get New Start. Nobody's talking about taking away New Start payments. Nobody's talking about a federal job guarantee being compulsory. It is an option which would be available to you, which doesn't exist at the moment. And it's not a question of a job guarantee or a universal basic income either. I don't want to talk about a universal basic income now, but there's no particular reason why you couldn't campaign for both if you thought that was feasible. An above poverty level job guarantee is not inflationary. We don't need to raise taxes in order to pay for it. We could implement a federal job guarantee now without increasing anybody's taxes at all. It is not incredibly expensive to do as far as the budget is concerned. And as I said, I think, given the state of the Australian economy at the moment, it would move the government budget balance to roughly where it ought to be in any case. It can empower the low paid and those in insecure employment. And as I said, it can address the non-financial costs of unemployment. And it also helps to stabilise the economy. The government's budget already acts as an automatic stabiliser to an extent. So when we had the global financial crisis and Australia almost had a recession, about a half of the turnaround in the government budget at the time just happened automatically because tax receipts fell and welfare payments increased. A job guarantee would improve the efficiency of the government budget as an automatic stabiliser because in a boom, when the economy was growing faster, then the size of the job guarantee pool would shrink. People would move out of the job guarantee into better paid jobs in the private sector and maybe elsewhere in the public sector. On the other hand, when you need the government to do more deficit spending during a downturn to support the economy, well, the job guarantee would automatically increase in size. And many of those things I was talking about on the previous slide are scalable activities. You could have more people working in them when you need to and fewer people when the economy is booming. It means spending where, when and on whom the spending needs to go. An untargeted fiscal stimulus tends to create inflation and is therefore inefficient because, of course, the people that benefit from it are the people that don't need the help in the first place. It creates a demand for skills which are in short supply and creates structural problems in the economy. A federal job guarantee takes workers as they are, gives people training opportunities if they want to undertake them, but allows people to decide whether they want to undergo more training when they're in a job guarantee or whether they don't. A federal job guarantee will offer employment to the nearly 100,000 people in Australia who've been unemployed for more than 2 years, who the private sector sees as damaged goods and who are unlikely on that basis to get a job in the near future and are likely otherwise to remain unemployed. A federal job guarantee will involve spending more where it needs to be spent. And if you want people to stop moving to Sydney and Melbourne because they're being forced to in order to get a job, if you want to continue to have rural communities and remote communities being viable, then a job guarantee will help you do that. It puts money into those areas which can then be spent in local businesses. It maintains social cohesion and supports and revives communities doing it tough. But it's not a new idea, not really. Job guarantee-like programs have been successfully implemented on a large scale in the recent past. Plan Jefes, which was something which Argentina introduced immediately after their last economic crisis in 2002, rapidly included 2 million people, which was 13% of the labour force in Argentina at the time. It did so without being inflationary. The programme naturally shrunk over time as Argentina's economy performed quite well leading up to the global financial crisis. After China, I think it may have been the highest growing economy in the world in the middle part of the 2000s. Regrettably, when they shouldn't have done, they phased it out when Argentina wasn't in a crisis anymore. There's been a rural employment guarantee in India for a long time now, and it's a massive programme. There's 50 million people in it. Don't tell me we can't administer a job guarantee with maybe 500,000 people in it. It's not perfect in all sorts of ways. It's squeezed for funding by the government. When the current Indian government came in, they would have liked to scrap it, but they couldn't scrap it because it was too popular. And that's the same thing we'd have here. If we got a federal job guarantee right, it would be so popular the governments of both persuasions would find it very difficult to remove once it was in place. And I've already mentioned Roosevelt's New Deal in the 1930s, which, by the way, a famous economist called Hyman Minsky, as a very young man, was a participant in. And Minsky started pushing for what he called an employer of last resort scheme, which has turned into our federal job guarantee proposal now, way back in the 1960s. People have been calling on governments to stop using unemployment and poverty and inequality to control inflation for 40 years, and that's what I'm doing. Now, that's what I think we should all do, not just to the coalition, but to the Labour Party as well, across an election campaign when we're talking to people who want to represent us in Canberra, want to take big decisions. If we could have full employment back in the 1960s, if we could have Scandinavian levels of inequality in the early 70s, why can't we do it again? So, a job guarantee. It has to be federally funded. Like New Start, there has to be no cap on the total spending on it. There needs to be a cap per job, sure, 40,000 plus about another 50% for capital and admin costs, and it would depend on the range of activities that people were working on in the job guarantee, but it would end up costing, on average, probably about 1.5% of GDP, but I don't care about that. I mean, it's not the right way of thinking about it. Really, as I said, the government budget needs to move towards deficit at the moment anyway. It should meet local needs. It should be available to everyone. It should be compulsory for no one. Given the experience of recent years, it's important that profit doesn't come into it, and that with the exception perhaps of small cooperatives, the private sector is not involved. It should help stabilise the economy across the cycle for the reasons I've been saying. It sets the appropriate fiscal deficit at the margin. How do you know you've got the fiscal deficit right? When the last person walks into a job guarantee office. It sets the minimum social wage and the minimum acceptable working conditions. It will be important, as far as possible, to ensure that it doesn't overlap with non-job guaranteed jobs, including in the public sector. It should nurture participants. There should be no, as I said, nobody's being forced to participate. It should not be an emergency measure. It should be permanent, like Medicare or like the Australian Army. It's not something we're going to get rid of. And the jobs involved, if they don't actually improve our ecological environment, they at least should not damage it. So to that extent, it should be green. 2, we certainly need a change. I thought I'd give you a quote from the Chief Executive of the Council of Small Business Organisations Australia, in case you thought only lefties were rather cynical about the current way of dealing with people who are unemployed and need help to get back into the labour force. This is a quote from Peter Strong. "We are creating millionaires on the back of the long-term unemployed by paying providers to offer a failed service. The people that win are the service providers, not the unemployed or the employers." As I've said, most employers really do not like getting lots of unsuitable job applications from people who are being forced to apply for 20 jobs, any old job, every month in order to keep their New Start payment. The whole system needs to be turned on its head. And these were not my words, these were his. I just want to make that clear. A message for laissez-faire economists. He said, not me. "You are a bunch of shallow intellects who have failed all of us due to your lazy pomposity." End message, said the Council of Small Business Organisations Australia Chief Executive Officer. So, the job guarantee is one element of Get Up's Future to Fight For campaign. You can see, I've mentioned a guaranteed basic income. We've been talking about a roof over every head. There are some other things too which would be interesting to talk about here on another occasion. Our view, the view of people like Stephanie and me, as far as the government's budget is concerned, is that it's more important to balance the economy than to balance the budget. And when we've got, as I said, nearly 100,000 people who've been unemployed for more than 2 years, then that's not what I call balancing the economy. If you're interested, given that I am an economic spokesman for Get Up, if you're interested in getting involved in the Future to Fight For campaign and Get Up's other campaigns, then Gabrielle Bond, the organiser, there she is, for Get Up in South Australia, is here. So you could have a chat to her. Otherwise, thanks very much for listening to me. And again, thank you very much to Claudia and to Alice and to Ali for helping out. And in the case of Claudia and Alice, for their excellent presentations. And we look forward to having some questions. Thank you very much.